mute yourself or turn off your video camera. But yeah, I'll hand you over to Joan. And
Thank
I'll
you,
let
Phil.
I won't be any problem with it.
Thank you, Phil. Hi to anybody that's I'm saying hello to for the first time this week. As Phil just mentioned, I think the video from last week is on the ASNet page, so you can find it there. So I'm going to share my screen with you once more. So this video series is called Good Nutrition for Arthritis. And whereas last week I talked about all the good stuff you can add into your diet to particularly focus on making it anti-inflammatory to reduce inflammation, this week it is important to look at as well the factors that are quite inflammatory. So I always like to start with what you can add in so that people don't feel deprived if they're changing their diet. So if we start off by focusing on the good stuff, what you can add in, then that's all quite exciting and you feel very nourished. But it is important as well to look at the flip side of the coin. So that's what I'm going to try to do today. So just to recap on last week, speaking about the anti-inflammatory diet, we said that the entirety of the diet might be more important than the sum of the parts. So sometimes people think that if you just add in a few super anti-inflammatory foods, like cover everything in turmeric, and then, you know, that will deal with the inflammation. But often synergy of foods within a diet and the diet as a whole is it's a very valuable point. We talked about how too much food, no matter how good it is, can be inflammatory, and in restricting food intake somewhat, just moderately if you don't need to lose weight, can be helpful. And if you do want to lose weight, then a healthy weight loss approach can also reduce inflammation. We talked about two kinds of essential fats, omega-6, which we get a lot in sunflower oil and therefore in processed foods which use sunflower oil a lot, and omega-3, which is a bit harder to get in the diet. Omega-6 is inflammatory, omega-3 is anti-inflammatory, so we want more of that, and that's through oily fish predominantly, but also plant sources would be flax seeds and walnuts and chia seeds. We will talk a little bit more about fats again today. Something I can deal with a bit more later on, perhaps in another session, but just mentioned the fact that one of the most anti-inflammatory things you can do diet-wise is to eat the rainbow of plants, especially vegetables, every day. But I think that's worth coming back to at a later date. Herbs and spices we're going to talk about again today can be very anti-inflammatory, and we talked about how extra virgin olive oil has a special place in the very anti-inflammatory Mediterranean diet, which this is, and this picture is up on your website as well now, which is a Mediterranean diet pyramid. So at the base of the pyramid are the foods which, if you eat, which are eaten most often in the Mediterranean diet and which are very anti-inflammatory. So a base of vegetables, fruit, whole grains, pulses, and then going up the pyramid, foods which you eat less and less. And last week we really focused on some of the things that are written on the left-hand side about how it's important to have that favorable omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. We talked about anti-inflammatory foods that you can include. This week, I'm sort of going more over to deal with the right-hand side of this image and talking about some of the things in particular that there's evidence for about being inflammatory in arthritis. So that's just a reminder of what we should be included in the diet and what should be less so. So those items at the top of the pyramid, say red meat, not included so much, and the items down on the bottom right and the text in this red box. You can go back to this later, and this is some of the things that we shouldn't be including. So it says trans fatty acids, for instance, high salt, high glycemic index, which means a lot of sugar, high calories. So these are some of the things that I'm going to be talking about today that are pro-inflammatory, and talking about them and what you can do to substitute other things for them in the diet, because it's not terribly helpful just to say, don't eat that. You need to know what you can eat instead. So the things that the points that are inflammatory that I'm going to cover today: inflammatory fats, because not all fats are good for us. We talked about the omega-3 fats that were good for us, but not all fats are good for us. Salt is, there's a lot of evidence around salt and inflammatory arthritis. So what to do about that? Sugar is one of the most inflammatory things that there are, one of the most inflammatory things that there is. And yet it's very addictive. So it's very difficult to, it can be difficult to reduce your sugar intake. So talking about ways to do that. And then whilst I don't want to personalize this too much, and there are other foods that will be inflammatory for individual people. So someone asked me last week, were nightshade vegetables good to eat, or were they inflammatory? Those are sort of individual questions that will be different from person to person. But I did want to mention gluten, which is a compound found in wheat, as being inflammatory for quite a lot of people. So I'm not going to get into some of the other nutrients that might be inflammatory for some. I'm trying to keep it applicable to as many people as possible today, but I think that gluten is affects enough people adversely that it's worth mentioning here. So starting off with the inflammatory fats then from that list, there's always a lot of there's some controversy in nutrition research about labeling good and bad fats and which fats are helpful for certain conditions and which might not be. And you'll probably be aware that throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s there was a big low fat movement, so that we were encouraged not to eat much dietary fat. That has somewhat reversed these days, and there are a lot of proponents of a high fat diet. What is not so much in question, however, and there's not much debate about it, are some of the fats that are not helpful to health. So even the proponents of a high fat diet will say that certain fats are inflammatory. And the biggest of those are a group called trans fats. So a trans fat doesn't occur naturally in the sort of fats and oils that we find naturally in food. It occurs when oils are overly processed. So this is why we are told not to reuse, for instance, oil that's been used in deep frying, because if you keep heating and reheating that oil, it can be transformed into a trans fat. And because these fats don't occur naturally, our bodies don't really know how to deal with them, how to break them down, and how to use them. As a result, they can cause inflammation. So we tend to get there's not many trans fats found in foods that you'd find at the supermarket anymore, but you can still get trans fats from, if you're eating a lot of takeaway foods, say from the what the food has been fried in. So they are not helpful for us by any stretch of the imagination. So minimizing your takeaway consumption is a good place to start in reducing your trans fats. Going back to last week when I talked about the omega-6 fats that we need to keep them in balance with omega-3 fats in the diet in order to influence inflammation and not have too much inflammation. But it's just worth saying again here, because it's such a straightforward thing to avoid, really, is to avoid the sunflower oil in particular, but also if you see a sort of unspecified vegetable oil, it's likely to be from sunflower seeds or other industrially grown sort of seed oils. They are inflammatory because of their omega-6 content. They also become easily damaged when you cook with them, because the omega-6 fat oil is very delicate. So we get these fats in the sunflower oil, but also in margarines and non-dairy spreads. And we just end up getting too much omega-6 that tips us over into inflammation. And I don't know if I mentioned last week, the sort of machinery in our body that uses omega-3, the good anti-inflammatory fats, it's the same machinery that uses omega-6, and there's only resources in the body to deal with a certain amount of either of these fats. So if we have a lot of omega-6, which is quite easy to do if you're having all these foods, the sunflower oil, the margarines, the spreads, we can't then potentially use the omega-3 that we do eat. So it's not just a case of trying to eat more and more oily fish. We actively have to cut down the amount of omega-6 that we have in order that the omega-3 can be processed properly in the body. So I often get asked, what then should I use instead of margarine or olive spread? You know, all these other spreads, they all have, well, most of them that I've found, they all have sunflower oil in them or some kind of inflammatory fat. So I often get asked what to use instead on bread, toast, whatever you're spreading on. Oh, sorry, I've gone ahead of myself. Sorry, that's going to be the next. Oops, that's going to be the next slide. So sorry, to summarize the what you can do then instead to swap healthy fats instead of harmful fats. You can, first of all, avoiding the quantities of fats that you need for deep frying, because you're just going to get too much that way. But for shallow frying and roasting, you can use any of these fats. Extra virgin olive oil, I mentioned last week, actually protects itself. The antioxidants in it protect it as it's heated, so that's okay to cook with actually. Avocado oil, similarly, and then you get onto the more stable kinds of fats, which are solid at room temperature, so they're higher in saturated fats. That means they're more stable, they don't get so damaged when you cook with them. So coconut oil is fairly stable when cooked with. Ghee is clarified butter, so it's if people are intolerant to dairy, they can often tolerate ghee because there's very little of the or none of the milk proteins or anything in it. So ghee can be a really anti-inflammatory fat actually, and small amounts of animal fats to cook with. I'm not talking about lashings of it, but in the amounts that you would normally cook with, the way our parents and grandparents might have cooked, are a better choice than cooking with the vegetable oils and the sunflower oils. I mentioned about spreads, and that's where I was going before. I thought that was my next slide, and what the best alternatives are to use instead of margarines and spreads. If you tolerate dairy and if you're happy eating dairy, then butter is better than margarine because it doesn't contain those inflammatory omega-6 fats. So a small amount of butter, ideally grass-fed butter is best, because that if the cows are allowed to eat grass the way they're meant to, then that affects the fatty acid composition of the milk and the butter much more favorably than if the cows are kept inside eating grain. So I know that Kerrygold, for instance, is made from butter from grass-fed cows, and they have a spreadable version that's just 100% butter. So that's quite a good choice. There are probably other grass-fed butters as well, but that's the only spreadable one that I know. If you're looking for a vegetable spread or vegan alternative to butter, then I think the best options are actually to not try and make a direct substitute. You could consider just doing something completely different, using something else that's completely natural to moisten the bread, depending what you're then having with it. So depending what you're having, all these are viable options. Hummus, nut butters are delicious and very moreish. Tahini paste is made just from it's a paste from sesame seeds. Olive tapenade, if you haven't come across it, is really delicious. It's just sort of mashed up olives basically, and ironically you need to watch out with buying olive tapenades. It comes in jars, and a lot of them are actually have sunflower oil added to them. Unfortunately, I have found a Sainsbury's own one that is olive oil with olive tapenade, so that's a good option, and that's quite a nice, a really nice savoury taste. You can put mashed avocado on bread or toast, or dip bread in olive oil as they do in Mediterranean countries. So those aren't direct swaps that might work for sandwiches, say, but if you're having bread alongside something else that you're eating, that might be a better choice. Those would all be better choices than margarine. This is the best of the vegan spreads that I've come across. It doesn't contain much omega-6 fat, so that's naturally organic, vegan, spreadable. It's not that there's some fats in it that aren't perfect, but it's the best that I have found of the vegan spreads, and that's widely available in supermarkets. So those would be my choices sort of for getting rid of both the sunflower oil and the spreads, the margarines, and then just not trying to bake things rather than deep fry, trying to find ways to reduce that sort of excess oil consumption that you get when you heat foods in oil for a long time. So that's what I wanted to say about fats, inflammatory fats. Moving on to salt, there's actually quite a lot. I don't actually spend that much time in my nutrition practice talking about salt in general, which is interesting, but there's quite a lot of research around salt and its impact on arthritis. We do need salt in the diet. I mean, salt in olden times was highly prized. It's referred to, for instance, in biblical texts as being, as valuable as salt. People were paid in salt. The word salary comes from salt. It shows how important salt is because the sodium in salt is absolutely essential for our electrolyte balance in the body. So for huge number of functions in the body, we do need some salt. So I'm not saying don't eat any salt, but high salt intakes lead to much more inflammation in the body. And it's really interesting. People have looked at the mechanisms for how this happens. And if you put various cells of our immune system in a lab, but if you put them into a saline solution, then they start to produce much more levels of inflammatory molecules than they would do if they're on a less saline solution. So when we have a high intake of salt in the body, water tends to follow salt in the body, and we end up with a much too salty interstitial fluid everywhere. And this just leads to our immune system overreacting. And whether you've got an autoimmune arthritis where the immune system is overreacting and by mistake attacking your joints, or whether you've got an osteoarthritis, there are still inflammatory molecules being released into the joint. So we don't want to encourage any more of that than possible. And manipulating salt intake is potentially quite an interesting way to try and influence inflammation. Also, a couple of other factors. People with arthritis, as I'm sure you know, are more at risk of fracture. And the more salt we have in the diet, the more calcium is lost from the bone and the more minerals are lost from the bone. You actually need less calcium in your diet the less salt is in your diet. And that's because of this. Salt is a calcium wasting factor. So it leads to less mineralized bones, which potentially increases fracture risk as well. And if you're ever on corticosteroids, they increase sodium retention anyway because of their effect on some of the steroid hormones released from the adrenal glands that regulate mineral balance in the body. So you do tend to get potentially swollen ankles or high blood pressure on corticosteroids. That can be a side effect, and high salt intake will make this worse. So you don't want to add to the problem, really. But as I said, we do need some salt. So if we were just seasoning our food with salt and cooking unprocessed food and then seasoning it, that doesn't tend to be too much of a problem. It's when we start to eat lots and lots of processed food that we unwittingly eat a lot of salt. And it's because salt does make food taste so palatable, and food manufacturers are very aware of this and manipulate the fat, the sugar, and the salt content of foods to make them what's called hyper palatable, so that we just keep wanting more. I'm sure you've probably sat on the sofa of an evening with be it a packet of crisps or Pringles or whatever sort of salty snack that you might have, and it's so moreish, and we end up eating more and more salt. But salt doesn't just find its way into those processed foods. It's a bit like sugar. It gets into lots of places where you might not expect so much. If you're eating unprocessed foods, if you're just seasoning your foods yourself, around about a teaspoon per day of salt added to your food is not likely to be a problem. Actually, when I was researching this and reading up around it, I was seeing figures of 1.5 to 3 teaspoons of salt added to an unprocessed diet might not be a problem. But there is, as I say, some evidence that higher salt, that was for the general population, and the evidence that higher salt levels can influence the inflammatory response in arthritis. I think saying around a teaspoon would be a safer level to set. And we're talking about sea salt here rather than table salt, which I'll go into in a moment. The other thing to say about salt is that sodium is the mineral that's in salt. Potassium opposes sodium in lots of actions in the body, and we find lots of potassium mostly in vegetables. I mean, bananas are famously high in potassium, but so are avocados, and so are lots of grains and lots of vegetables generally. So if your diet has hardly any veg in it, the effects of sodium, the salt, will be more pronounced. So you're offsetting some of that encouraging inflammation by having plenty of potassium from vegetables. So potassium has actually been shown, not in arthritis, but in other inflammatory bowel conditions. It's been shown that immune cells, which were previously in a high salt solution that were creating all these inflammatory molecules, they calmed down when there was more potassium added. So potassium just balances out those effects. So this is why it's important to look at your diet as a whole and not just one individual component. So you may find that you could have slightly more salt if you're having more vegetables, whereas if you're eating a fairly beige diet, then salt is all the more inflammatory. So the salt to avoid is in processed foods. And as I say, it's not just the obvious ones like crisps, say, and salty snacks. There's also quite high levels of salt in things like soaps and canned goods. And salt is one of those ingredients that's flagged on food labeling. So, you know, I just looked up in preparing this a couple of soaps on a supermarket website, and you can see that the salt is in orange or red in all of them. So if you're eating a lot of tinned goods, you will end up having more salt just by default. And avoiding refined table salts where you can, because it really is stripped of anything other than sodium chloride. So instead, you can choose a sea salt, be that something like pink Himalayan salt or Celtic sea salt. You can also get. I sort of buy, I don't know if you can see in my photograph, in my video rather than on my slides, I buy big bags of Himalayan pink salt from online sellers, be it Amazon or elsewhere, and then just decant that into a little salt cellar. And that's a cheaper way to buy Himalayan salt. So the reason I'm recommending those is they do have other trace minerals in them, which have been taken out of table salt. So you're in the same way as potassium from vegetables will balance out some of the effects of sodium. If you're getting other trace minerals along with your sodium, you're getting some other balancing effects. And we don't always know all these ins and outs of the benefits of getting all the trace minerals, but this is salt in a much more natural state, and I'm all for just the wisdom of nature and going with how things would be found naturally. The other thing you can do instead of using salt is to use seaweed, which of course tastes salty and has lots of minerals from the sea that occur naturally along with the sodium. You do need to be careful if you've got any thyroid issues about the amount of iodine that you end up eating if you're having lots of seaweed. But for moderate amounts of seaweed, for the amount that we all use it shouldn't really be a problem. So these are some different seaweeds that I found in the cupboard. Some of them are like the dulse in the top right corner, that's just dehydrated seaweed that you can rehydrate and use on top of salads or vegetables or whatever. Some of the ones in the foreground, the sea greens and the sea spoon, they're all sprinkles or really finely ground seaweed that you can use, shake over food the same way that you would do salt, but you're getting a lot of different minerals from that rather than just salt. And the final thing, the more that you use herbs and spices, the more interesting your food will taste and the less salt you need to add to it. And you know, fresh herbs are great, but also dried herbs and spices. And if you keep them on a spice rack or easily accessible on your worktop, you're much more likely to use them than if they're hidden away in the back of a cupboard. So keep them where you can see them and use them liberally. They do reduce they reduce salt intake, and they can also reduce how much you have to sweeten foods as well, which brings me on to my next nutrient to avoid, not nutrient, food to avoid, which is sugar. Now, sugar really drives inflammation like hardly anything else. And that's because if our blood sugar goes up and down all the time, it's a big stress for the body. It's very inflammatory for the body. So much so that I'd planned to do a whole section about blood sugar really at the end of the month. So I'm not going to go into the mechanisms of how it happens and why it's inflammatory just today. But yeah, sugar is one of the most inflammatory nutrients that there is. And it's not just refined sugar, it's hiding all over the place in all sorts of nutrients. So there's a list of just some of the names that you might find on the ingredients list of foods, that some of them may be more natural than others, but they will all raise your blood sugar. And that's the process that's inflammatory. And an added one on the end, maltodextrin, through some quirk and loophole of food labeling, does not have to be declared as a sugar. So sometimes things will say sugar-free and they contain maltodextrin. It actually acts on your blood sugar faster than table sugar does. So that's an extra one to avoid. I'm not quite sure why it doesn't have to be declared. I remember signing one of these petitions that go around the internet one time to say that maltodextrin should have to be declared as a sugar, but it still doesn't have to be. So the sugar sneaks in under lots of different names in lots of places where you wouldn't expect it to. Artificial sweeteners, so this is the things like sucralose, aspartame, sulfame, there's the various names for them and they come under different brand names. The non-calorific sweeteners, the ones that don't have any sugar in. They don't raise your blood sugar, it is true, but they still sort of condition your body to expect sugar. So they're not entirely benign. So they, you know, they keep you craving sugar if you're someone who craves sugar, and they might have an adverse effect on the gut. And they may also, although the evidence is really sketchy, have some of the adverse effects on metabolism that sugar does, because your brain is expecting to get a sweet hit when you have an artificial sweetener. So all this, I mean, they just continue to make it difficult to escape eating sugar. So I tend to recommend people trying just to reduce their sugar consumption considerably, so that the only sweeteners that you're using, if you can, are whole fruits. So say in baking, using, you know, you can get recipes with applesauce or with dates, or, you know, these things are still sweet, but they're coming with fiber and other nutrients as well as sugar. The more you cut out sugar, the more your taste buds will change, absolutely, for definite. And this is where the artificial sweeteners are keeping people trapped, really, because they're not changing people's taste, not allowing people's taste buds to change. So if you get rid of a lot of the refined sugar and sweeteners from your diet, you suddenly taste the sweetness of fruit. And you also are much more discerning of other savory tastes, because your whole palate just changes. You do need to be eating enough protein to stop sugar cravings. So eating protein with every meal is important when you're trying to get off sugar. And then some tips and tricks that have helped me personally. I find that herbal teas, either with cinnamon in it. I mean, cinnamon is great for giving a slightly sweet taste and balancing blood sugar and getting rid of sugar cravings as well. So cinnamon tea is quite helpful. And licorice, any herbal teas with licorice in them. Be careful with licorice if you've got high blood pressure, because it can raise blood pressure. But if you don't, licorice gives a really sweet aftertaste, so it can be really helpful in herbal teas. Particularly if you're the sort of person that craves something sweet after a meal, if you have a sort of slightly sweet tasting herbal tea, it can help. And the longer you keep going with that, the sweeter it will taste. Brushing your teeth after meals, again, if you crave sugar after meals, this can make you feel nice and clean and virtuous, and that you just don't want to spoil your mouth by eating something. And then the last two tips are just sort of psychological and thinking about why you're craving sugar and what it is that you need, and whether you really need something else instead, whether you need some company or something to do, or something a bit more helpful to you to perk you up instead. And thinking about how you'd feel if you ate sugar. Would it really make a difference to how you feel? Would you feel better in the end? I gave a talk last night to a different group of people, and we were talking about sugar as well. And another tip that came up, and this is quite an individual thing, some people were saying that if they have just a square of or two of dark chocolate, that helps them with cravings. But for some people, that's a slippery slope onto eating the whole bar. So it really depends how you are at just having a little bit and then not going on. So these are some of the teas that I like. I do like Pukka herbal teas, but I don't sponsor them or anything. They don't sponsor me. Other herbal brands are available. But of these all contain either cinnamon or licorice. I find the peppermint and licorice one really noticeably sweet aftertaste, and sometimes if I do feel like something sweet after a meal, then that will hit the spot, unlikely as it sounds. And dark chocolate will really need to be around about 75 to upwards % cocoa solids, so that it's not got too much sugar just by eating that. But again, with time, this starts to taste quite sweet. So that would be my chocolate of choice, but there are other brands as well. Lindt do some very dark chocolate, Montezuma's chocolate. There are quite a lot of good brands readily available these days. I think it can be it's very facile to say reduce your sugar. I don't underestimate how difficult it can be, but those are some of the first places to start. And sometimes as well, this sense of it's the whole diet that matters. It depends whether you're getting enough fiber and protein and enough nutrients to keep you really full in the rest of your diet will make a big difference as to how easily you can master sugar cravings, or whether it's difficult for you or not. So yeah, I do try to spend quite a bit of time really in my practice supporting people with sugar cravings, because it's so all pervasive. And again, the less processed food you eat, the less sugar you will be exposed to without realizing it. Because, it's one thing to enjoy a treat that you've decided deliberately to have, but then to find out that there was a lot of sugar in your soup, or in a quiche that you ate, or wherever sugar has ended up, that sometimes feels like you're being a little bit cheated, like you were having that sugar and it was causing inflammation and you didn't even really notice it. So unprocessing your diet, eating whole foods, can stop you getting that extra sugar intake. I mentioned gluten at the start, and I'm only going to talk about it briefly, really, but I think it affects enough people that it's worth doing so. What is gluten? It's a protein that's found in some grains, including wheat, rye and barley. And I mentioned spelt because there's a bit of confusion. Sometimes spelt is an old form of wheat, but it still contains gluten. Now, of course, gluten must be strictly avoided by anybody with celiac disease, who have to avoid even the merest hint of gluten for life. What's more controversial is whether anybody who isn't celiac should avoid gluten or not. It can cause an inflammatory response in quite a lot of other people, and this is increasingly present in the scientific literature, called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and it happens via the gut. What gluten does in the gut is that it we have a layer of cells between our digestive tract and our bloodstream, and they are designed to selectively allow nutrients through and keep toxins out. It's just one cell thick, and these cells, you can envisage them sitting on top of each other like bricks on top of each other in the wall of a well, and imagine that there is grout between these bricks. So these cells lining our gut are tight together, tight against one another. What gluten does is it causes an opening of the joints between these cells. And it does this in everybody, but in some people that stays open for longer. Whereas in people who don't react to gluten, they seem to close together and become tight again the way they're meant to be. So if gluten causes these cells in the gut to come apart, it can let toxins, undigested particles of food through into our bloodstream, things that aren't meant to be there. The theory is that the immune system then reacts to these by mistake, thinking that they're invaders, and either in the crossfire or by mistake attacks tissues of our body, such as the joints. So it's thought that gluten is a major trigger of can be a major trigger of autoimmune conditions, including autoimmune arthritis for some people. There's also quite a big overlap between people who have celiac disease and certain other autoimmune conditions. So there's a higher incidence of celiac in people with psoriatic arthritis than there is in the general population, for instance. So these conditions tend to go together, and it may be that in some people there is a common mechanism that started off both autoimmune conditions. So one way or the other, we don't know for certain that gluten is causing anything, and the evidence on gluten and arthritis is, there's some evidence to say that it can play a role. It's not hugely convincing, and I think that's because it may be a really important factor for some people, but not for everyone. So when you're doing studies on big groups of people, maybe that averages out and you don't see the effect. I believe that for some people with autoimmune disease, that getting rid of gluten from the diet can be really helpful in reducing inflammation. There was one interesting trial that showed that a year of people with rheumatoid arthritis who tried a vegan and gluten-free diet for a year experienced a reduction in disease activity. And the authors of the study sort of hypothesized that this was because there were fewer compounds from their diet that they were reacting to, but they didn't separate out the gluten-free bit from the vegan aspect of the diet. So we're not too sure. There was another study on people with psoriatic arthritis who found that they had a higher prevalence of antibodies against the gluten than people did from the general population. So that if you took a group of people with an inflammatory arthritic condition and looked at whether they reacted to gluten or not, you find that that was more likely in them than in people who didn't have psoriatic arthritis. So it's sort of weak evidence, but like I say, it might be worth trying, and it might be a missing piece of the sort of the puzzle for you. So if you were considering this and to see whether gluten made a difference to symptoms, you tend to need to avoid gluten for about a month, a calendar month, to really make a difference in terms of reducing immune system activity against the gluten. However, when avoiding gluten, it's not necessarily terribly nutritious to go down the gluten-free aisle in the supermarket and eat the gluten-free substitutes instead. So this is what I really wanted to cover here, was what you could eat instead if you were thinking of avoiding gluten, to see how it impacted your symptoms, if at all. So rather than trying to find direct substitutes, I know it's a challenge, but I think it can be better to try and just focus on what foods you can eat and just plan different meals, rather than trying to find gluten-free breads in particular. Can be difficult to find good ones. So the things that you can eat that are gluten-free, the grains are rice, quinoa, buckwheat, despite having the word wheat in it, is gluten-free. Millet, amaranth, you'd probably only find in health food stores. Corn and oats. If the oats are often processed along with gluten and they end up having traces in it, but you can get gluten-free oats, and oats themselves don't contain gluten. So those grains are good to eat on a gluten-free diet. And then you can also get your carbohydrates from starchy vegetables, potatoes, sweet potatoes, squashes, etc. All vegetables and fruit are gluten-free. And then all the rest of the foods in the diet, all the rest of the whole foods, vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, pulses, dairy, eggs, and animal products are all naturally gluten-free. So rather than thinking of what you can't have, focusing on a list of foods that you can have and putting unprocessed meals together from those can be a more helpful approach. There are, however, more gluten-free products all the time as more and more people try avoiding gluten, and there are some not bad ones among them. So for instance, with pasta is an easier swap than bread. You can get chickpea pasta, brown rice pasta, buckwheat pasta, depending on what supermarket you're shopping in. It's quite easy to get a pasta product that's no more processed than wheat flour pasta is. Bread is a bit more difficult. So in my recipes this week, I have included a gluten-free bread that doesn't need to be kneaded at all. It's just it's quite a dense bread, a bit more, I suppose, like the texture of a tea bread or something, but savory. It's made from ground almonds, ground flax seeds, eggs, so it's not vegan, and you can put herbs in. And this is a bread that goes really well with things like soups or as a side dish. It's not so much a bread that you would make sandwiches out of. And as I say, it's quite dense and it's quite filling, but it does have the advantage of being pretty easy to make. You just mix it all up with a mixer and pop it in a loaf tin and into the oven. It doesn't require proving or kneading or anything like that. And it really is delicious. And I tend to make a loaf of it every so often, slice it once it's cooled, and then put it into the freezer sliced. And then whenever I fancy a bit of bread with soup or something, I'll take out a few slices to defrost or to toast. So it's really quite easy in term as bread making goes. And I'd rather do that than buy one of the supermarket gluten-free breads, because they tend to have just loads of sweeteners and thickeners and weird starches, like, you know, potato starch and this starch and that starch. And by the time I'd have gone through all the ingredients and decided whether I wanted to eat them or not, and then gluten-free breads don't tend to taste the same as gluten breads made from gluten. What gluten does is that it's quite stretchy, and as when you bake with it, this is why it's such an attractive ingredient and why we use wheat so much, because it provides that lovely sort of stretchy light structure that we enjoy in breads. And in order to recreate that without using gluten, you tend to need to add such a lot of additives. So having a gluten-free bread recipe that you can make yourself, I think of it more as a route to transitioning away from bread. Whilst you work out what other meals you can possibly make that don't involve bread, you can have some of this whilst you're sort of working it out and going through that process. So yeah, this one is well tried and tested, and I really like it. And the next recipe I want to show you was just this concept of if you're having if you've got a sweet craving and you want to satisfy your sweet craving, energy balls are really quite popular, or you can make them in bars instead if you were to just press this mixture into a baking tin or something. But it's this concept of having dried fruit as your sweetener, but then putting protein and fiber with it from either nuts or seeds, in order to what this does is it slows down the spike in blood sugar, making the dried fruit less inflammatory than it could be. You can really make energy balls with pretty much any combination of dried fruit and nuts or seeds. If you use twice as much nuts or seeds to dried fruit. So here I've got apricots and sunflower seeds. You could make it with dates and almonds, or possibly raisins and cashew nuts or something if you use those sort of quantities. So you can experiment around. Why I included this recipe particularly then is because it's got turmeric and black pepper in there as particularly anti-inflammatory nutrients. And whilst I did say that it's the diet as a whole that matters, not particular superfoods as anti-inflammatory ingredients, if they work with what you're having anyway, then why not include them? So this is just mixing up all the ingredients in a food processor and then making them into individual bite-sized balls. Or like I say, you could tip it into a small baking tray and press it down with a palette knife and sort of make it into bars. There's no cooking involved at all. So yeah, that's a way, because even if you ate dried fruit by itself, you would be getting quite a sugar hit. It's the fiber and the protein and the fat from the nuts and seeds with it that slow down our blood sugar impact. So there's a gluten-free recipe there, a refined sugar-free recipe for a sweet treat. And in terms of, I didn't put one in for the reduced salt because that's more of a just deprocessing your diet thing to reduce your salt intake. But what I'd be really interested in hearing now at the end as to whether any of you have tried any of these approaches as an active way of trying to manage symptoms and whether you've had any good results from it at all. So because I'm more or less finished what I wanted to talk about. So I'll stop sharing and just open it up and ask if anybody's tried any of this.
Thanks, Jane. That's very interesting. Yeah. So yeah, let's open it to the floor then. Has anybody tried these techniques?
Yes, we've tried the seaweed, the ground seaweed, and we use potassium chloride rather than sodium chloride.
Oh, is that the is it Herbalife or something, that the salt alternative that you can get?
Low salt, isn't it?
Is it low salt?
Called low salt?
I bought a kilo of ground seaweed.
No, it's not about the low
but the
salt.
low salt, yeah, is the potassium chloride.
And did you find that did it make any difference in terms of inflammation, or was it part of a lot of other things that you were doing anyway and hard to tell?
Hard to tell.
We just heard on the television it was more healthy.
I've been using turmeric for the last few years.
Yeah.
I take a good teaspoon of that every morning with some oil, black pepper, and I've increased my oils like olive oil.
Yeah, yeah.
But my inflammation has gone down hugely in the last few years, and my inflammatory markers are negative now. So
something of the totality of what you're doing is doing that. Yeah,
well, I know there's an awful lot more I could do, and particularly with because my daughter is celiac, so that sort of alerted me to all the changes I could make and what utter rubbish is out there in the name of gluten-free.
Yeah, yeah, and especially if someone's celiac, then they need all the help to absorb nutrients because of the damage in the small intestine. So I talk to celiacs just about how you need to make every mouthful count rather than wasting it on the gluten-free rubbish, like you say, because you need to be getting your nutrient density with everything that you're eating. So are you a gluten-free household then?
No.
Because no, yeah.
Rubbish household. Well, everyone does their own thing pretty much. But no, she's got her own gluten-free, and you know, sadly, a lot of it is substitute, and sadly, she has far too much sugar in her diet.
Yeah, it's difficult.
You know, they're also prone to, they have a much higher risk of type 1 diabetes.
Going gluten-free improved my RA within 2 weeks.
Why? Yeah.
David,
yeah. May I ask a question?
Yes.
When you first started, you were talking about spreads. And then you said about olive oil. On the market, there's some olive oil spreads like Bertolli and things like that. What's your opinion on those?
I think firstly, if they were completely olive oil, then I wouldn't necessarily have a problem. But they do tend to have, when you look at the labeling, they tend to have other oils in there as well, and they tend to be blends. And some of those other oils aren't so great. And also, I do just question about we're told now that there aren't hydrogenated oils in spreads. So when you're looking at things that fats that should be oils are just fats that are liquid at room temperature. So sunflower oil, olive oil, they should be liquid at room temperature. In order to get them into a block that people can spread, you have to process it and do various chemical things to it. That used to be by a process called hydrogenation, and you ended up with a harmful oil. Hydrogenated oils aren't sold in supermarkets now, etc. I'm still not entirely sure, and I should really check out how they make those liquid oils, solid, because it just feels like something that shouldn't happen naturally, and I wonder what impact that has. So yeah, I used to, before I looked into it, or before I was a nutritionist, I used to have olive oil spreads thinking that they were the best choice. But I actually think if you eat dairy, then butter can actually be quite anti-inflammatory, and ghee even more so, because it also it has an anti-inflammatory action that's separate from what we've talked about, because it provides a little bit of a compound called butyrate that's very anti-inflammatory in the gut, and that's where a lot of our inflammation comes from. So butter and ghee can actually be quite anti-inflammatory, and that's why I say they're a better choice, really.
It's interesting because ghee used to be one of the no-nos.
Yes.
Wasn't it? Because is it saturated fat?
Yes, there's a lot of saturated fat in it. And I still have, when I have Asian clients and I ask them what they cook with, and they say almost without exception, sunflower oil. And I say, could you cook with ghee? Well, I could do, but I've been told not to do that for years and years. And yes, of course, my grandmother did that. But, and I think just from the point of view of, even without evidence, but just looking at the epidemic of non-communicable sort of chronic diseases that we didn't have generations ago, there are so many factors in that, but one factor in it has been the movement away from doing what our grandmothers did. So yeah.
How about the sesame seed?
Sesame seed, again, will be very high in omega-6, and it's a very delicate oil. So it does, that omega-6 fat does tend to get damaged as you heat it.
Yeah, you mentioned the sunflower oil, but you haven't mentioned rapeseed oil. Is that the same?
No, rapeseed oil is a different crop, and it gets a fairly good press because it's got a high smoke point, and it also has quite a high omega-3 content. It also has quite a high omega-6 content. I just tend to avoid it because there's better evidence around the health benefits of other oils like olive oil. I think we mentioned this last week. And rapeseed oil sort of came from a crop. Rapeseed at first was an industrial oil that then had to be modified in order to make it fit to produce an oil that's fit for consumption. So again, just thinking from a traditional foods point of view, I'm a little bit dubious, but I haven't seen any evidence that it's harmful, it's fair to say.
I normally use the sesame oil and the sunflower oil and corn oil.
Okay, so they are all quite high in omega-6, and therefore will be pushing up inflammation. And then there are two now, I think, really good studies that looked at heating various different oils, and olive oil just came out the best in terms of how little damage it sustained when it was heated, because it's got a really high antioxidant content, and those antioxidants, they're a bit like little fire extinguishers putting out the damage when it gets heated up. So much more so than the other oils that they tested.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've been following a vegan and cooking with no oils at all. I followed a chap in Australia that sort of made his alleviated his rheumatoid arthritis symptoms. So that, and combining that with exercise. So I did that a few years ago. Lost about 25 kilos.
Why?
Because I was exercising, and it made me. I mean, some people thought I was ill, even though I was feeling good. Mm-hmm. But as I've gone on, I've added some processed foods. I'm still vegan. I've added some processed foods and things like some margarines, but the inflammation has got worse. So I'm wondering whether I need to actually go back and onto the strict approach that I was using.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when you cut out all oils, you get rid of a lot of the inflammatory oils. I guess long term, it's whether, I mean, you do need some fat in your diet, even if it's only the essential fats. You need some omega-3 in your diet. But yeah, you probably got rid of a lot of the inflammatory stuff along the way.
Coffee and all processed foods to begin with. But to be honest, as time's gone on, I've added things. So I might have some sort of vegan pies, but then when you start to look at the back of a packet, it's a bit frightening, isn't it, when you see what's in them?
Yeah, which is why the number one step, if you want to reduce inflammation from your diet, is always just to forget about the detail in a way of whether you should be vegan or paleo or ketogenic or whatever, and just unprocess your diet and eat whole foods. That's a much bigger impact than whether you're gluten-free and processed or vegan and processed, or, you know, because yeah.
But I mean, I think I'm a living example of it. It did work for me. The change was incredible.
Yeah. Was it hard to sustain?
No, I mean, I kept it up for, I think the idea is you introduce things, you start from sort of, you eliminate most things and then slowly build up.
Yeah.
I started off eating lots of things like sweet potato and quinoa, buckwheat.
Yeah.
And some of the other grains that you were saying. There's one from South America. Was that Amaranth one?
Quinoa's from South America.
Amaranth.
There was another one. There was
Amaranth. Yeah.
Because I think they contain some of the essential amino acids, don't they?
Yeah. Quinoa's yeah.
So I started on that. And then I suppose you just, to be honest, when you think you're okay, you will start adding things just out of excitement. So I think, but it definitely worked. But it was just the initial stages were hard when you're completely changing your diet. But once you, like anything, when you get in the rhythm of doing it, you begin to appreciate the taste of things more.
Yeah, absolutely. Your taste buds do adjust. So it's really good to hear. I just wanted to add in some real lived experience rather than just theory, I guess, to benefit everyone.
Can I ask another question? I might be a bit thick, but what's the difference between using a knob of butter and ghee for your cooking?
I'm not an expert and I've never made ghee, but as I understand it, ghee is made by heating butter and skimming off what rises to the top, so it's called clarified butter. So it will certainly, if there are any traces of milk proteins in butter, they'll probably be removed by the process of skimming off the top. I don't know if anyone else has made ghee and can explain it more clearly than that.
Yeah, some recipes years ago when I did lots more cooking, it would say clarified butter, and you have to clarify it before you add it. Yeah, so there's likely to be fewer allergens if there's anything that you're reacting to in butter. So some people who are very sensitive to lots of foods might not even be able to have butter, but they might be okay with ghee. And also, I think if you remove or if you clarify it, it doesn't burn, I always put a little bit of olive oil in with my butter anyway to stop it burning, but clarifying it definitely makes it an easier oil to cook with.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
Joan, you talked a bit about that, you were saying, I think last week, that any food is inflammatory, and we're talking a bit about fasting. What's your take on intermittent fasting, when you might there's a certain fad now where you might eat in an 8-hour window? So say, for example, you might eat from 12 o'clock midday and eat your food between then and 8 o'clock at night. Is there any?
Yeah, I think there's several different things going on, and there's one of the leading researchers into fasting doesn't like general questions about it, because he said, we don't say, is eating good for you? Why do we say, is fasting good for you? There's so many different ways to fast, but that one is called time restricted eating. Some of the benefits are probably to do with eating with your body clock. There's a lot of research now around eating in your circadian rhythms, and that it's not good for you to eat in the middle of the night. So shift workers have risk of more health conditions, partly because they're doing things out of sync with their circadian rhythm. So some of the benefits are because of that. Some of it's because if you restrict your time, people automatically seem to consume fewer calories. And also it is true that every time we eat, we have a little inflammatory response as our body processes the food. So if you cut down the number of times that you eat during the day, you're reducing inflammatory responses with every snack that you cut out. And there's not much you can do about that. I mean, some foods are more inflammatory than others, but just the process of eating and digesting will cause inflammation. Interestingly, I've been trying there's what's called a 5-day fasting mimicking diet, where you, according to a particular plan, reduce calories quite a lot for 5 days. So you do still eat. It's not complete fast, but it seems to have some of the metabolic benefits of fasting. So that's been interesting. I've been doing that myself this last month and the month before, and I'm going to continue doing it for a few more months, for 5 days a month, and see what happens. But there's a lot of research on the benefits of that as well. I'm not sure if it's been researched in arthritis. That has been researched in a lot of conditions. I can check that one out. Yeah, there's a lot to be said just for not eating late at night.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Joan. That's very interesting. Yeah, there's a lot to take in there again, but I have to go back and go through that. But I can hang on to the thing about not eating at night.
Yeah.
Can manage to do. Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. See you next week.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Bye, Bert.
Thank you.